In 1987, Elkland, Missouri was a quiet and unassuming town populated with about 200 people and farms settled in the rolling foothills of the surrounding Ozarks. But at the events that unfolded on September 25th would shake the sleepy town to its core when it seemed a 14-year-old boy had killed his parents, three younger brothers, driven to his uncle's house and killed his aunt, and then died in a struggle trying to kill his uncle. While it seemed like an open and shut case, there were still questions in the backs of folks' minds. What could drive such a young kid to do such a thing to his entire family? And how did this uncle manage to fend him off and become the only surviving member of this massacre? The truth would be as grisly as the murder, as affairs, lies, and dark secrets began to surface in this mass murder investigation. Today we are talking about the Elkland, Missouri Massacre of 1987 and survivor Jim Schnick. My name is Misty Sims, and this is Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Buckle up, and let's dive right in. Around 6 a.m. on September 25, 1987, the Webster County Sheriff's Department received a call about a violent attack that had happened on a farm in Elkland. The call came from Jim Schnick, who was 36 years old at the time. Jim told them the attack happened in his home that he shared with his wife Julie and their two young kids, and the attacker had shot him and he needed help immediately. So police rushed to the scene, and they found Jim on the kitchen floor in a large amount of pain. He had been shot twice, once in the leg and once in the abdomen. And paramedics began working on Jim, who seemed just almost delirious with the pain, and he even struggled with them a little bit in the beginning. He was taken to St. John's Regional Health Center in Springfield, Missouri to get some treatment. Police would further investigate into the home, and the scene that they found there was just gruesome. They found the body of Kirk Buckner, the couple's 14-year-old nephew, on the floor in the hallway. He was clutching a .22 caliber pistol called a Saturday Night Special that belonged to his mother, Jan Buckner, in his right hand. And they also found the body of Jim's wife, 30-year-old Julie, in the couple's bedroom. She had been shot twice in the forehead, and she was still in the bed under her blankets, so it was believed that she may have still been asleep when she was attacked. Their two children, 8-year-old Jamie and 6-year-old Mindy, were also found, but they were thankfully unharmed. And it was actually Jamie who woke up just after the attack and was able to help his dad get to the phone to make the call to the authorities. Now, before the police had arrived, Julie's parents had actually gotten to the farm and made their way up to the house to try to check on the couple when they hadn't heard from them. And they came in and saw Jim on the floor and their grandson dead in the hall. And they said they asked Jim what happened, and he told them that Kirk just came in the door shooting. They took the kids home with them and, of course, began the process of trying to make sense out of what they had just witnessed and then grieve the loss of their daughter and their grandson. When police were able to finally question Jim, they asked, who had done this to him. And Jim told them that he had been milking and heard a shot, so he headed back up to the house to see what in the world was going on. And he wasn't sure in the beginning who the attacker was, as he couldn't get a great look at them since it was still early morning hours and the attacker was in the shadows. And then he was shot. Now, he was able to grab a steak knife from the table and struggle with the assailant and would end up stabbing him, and the attacker wound up dying in that struggle. And that was when Jim was able to get a good look at him and realized that it was indeed his nephew, Kirk Buckner, who had done this. Now, police, of course, now have to be sent over to the Buckner farm to let them know what just happened at the Schnick home and then tell them about their son. Their farm was only about 5 miles up the road from the Schnicks, and it was described as, fairly overgrown, and it was pretty much in squalor and poverty. The family was already experiencing some just really difficult times due to the 1980s farm crisis, and of course, this news is not going to help anything. But Deputy Sheriff Rowe had no idea that when he arrived and saw the peeling paint, unmowed grass, debris, that wasn't all he was about to find. Now, he could tell something was off because when he arrives, he doesn't see any of the Buckners outside, and by this point, they should be out working on the farm and doing daily chores. So he knocked at the home's front door, and there was no answer, but it was unlocked. So he went on in, and he noticed, that the home was pretty filthy and unkept, but he kind of, just brushed that off, kept moving around, calling out to the family, and that was when he found the bodies of the 3 young Buckner boys, 8-year-old Dennis, 6-year-old Timmy, and 2-year-old Michael. Dennis and Timmy had been shot twice in their head and were found dead in their bunk beds, while Michael was found in his bed in another room, also shot twice in the head. Goes without saying that was not what the officer was prepared to see there. So he goes outside to try to check around the perimeter of the home to see what he can find, and that's where he sees 36-year-old Jan Buckner lying on the ground near the milk barn with 3 gunshot wounds to the back of her head. So police presence increases, and they start searching everywhere, and they can't find Steve Buckner. He is nowhere to be found. And now they're starting to wonder, did he kill his family and then go on the run? But that was quickly squashed when later that afternoon they actually found him in Pleasant View Cemetery, and he had been shot in the back of his head. So now police have multiple crime scenes to process and take in all this evidence. And that includes the jeans that Jim was wearing, that steak knife, and the .22 caliber pistol. Now that night, they go back to the hospital to talk to Jim, and Sheriff Rowe is with him this time. And he's great friends with Jim and has been for a long time, but he has to tell him, hey, this isn't between friends. This is official business now, police business. I need you to recount those events again and in great detail. So Jim says he got up early that morning, went outside to check on a cow that was supposed to be birthing a calf soon. And when he was on his way back to the house, he saw flashes of light and heard gunshots coming from inside the home. So he ran back to the house, and it was really dark. He couldn't make out, the shadowy figure at the end of the hall, but that figure fired on him and hit him in the leg. Now, Jim was able to grab that knife from the kitchen table and ultimately stab the intruder during, a huge struggle. And it was during that struggle that the intruder also shot him in the abdomen. Jim was finally able to kill the intruder, and now that the chaos had stopped, that was when he realized it was his nephew, Kirk. Now, Jim's injuries to his abdomen and his leg weren't life-threatening. In fact, they were actually pretty superficial. So the hospital was willing to release him that day, but he requested to stay in the hospital for a few more days, probably just to calm down from all the events. So Sheriff Rowe noted all this down, thanked Jim for his cooperation, and headed out. Now, as you can imagine, like most small towns, this news had spread like wildfire. People were gathering at the town's only little store, and they were talking about it, grieving together. And these families were well known and thought of, and thinking Kirk could do this was just a hard pill for them to swallow. But police, they put together a timeline of what they thought happened based on what Jim had said, and they believed at the time that Kirk had woken up that morning, gotten his mother's pistol, began firing on his siblings, and then he went outside, shot his mother, saw his father sitting next to, the family truck, fired on him in the back of the head. He pulled his father's body out at the cemetery and left it there, dumping it and taking the truck on to his aunt and uncle's house, where he shot his aunt while she was still in the bed, and then was trying to shoot his uncle when the struggle began and ultimately took his life. Now, students at the school where Kirk attended, they were in disbelief of what happened, and they didn't buy into what Kirk was being accused of. They said he was a good kid. He loved his family, loved his brothers. He even helped take care of them. He was mild-mannered, he was quiet, he was cooperative. He'd never been violent with anybody, words or fist-wise, according to his junior high school principal. He was literally his mom's right-hand man. And nobody could have, find anything or had anything negative to say about him, except one friend, Bill Shoemaker, who had saved Kirk from drowning in 1985, and he said Kirk showed up at his house the day before the murders, and he seemed depressed, and that this could have been related to the fact that Steve and Julie, Kirk's parents, had been struggling pretty much for the past 2 years financially, and they were behind on their 110-acre farm mortgage, and they were just trying to make it day to day. They were relying heavily on the kids for farm work because they couldn't afford to pay employees, and Kirk wasn't even sleeping in the house. He was sleeping in a bed in the camper portion of the truck because the family had outgrown their tiny farm home. He was waking up in the morning, doing all his chores before the sun was up, getting himself ready for school, catching the bus, so he's already worn out by the time he gets to school, And on top of that, he's working odd jobs to try to help his family out financially. And the people who knew the Buckners, they said Kirk was always a happy kid with a smile on his face. But the police, based on all of this, just made a conclusion that outside appearances, they can be deceiving. And inside Kirk, maybe he was struggling. The poverty and the hard times were just too much, and maybe he resented his father. And he finally just snapped and went into a rampage. But why the aunt and uncle? Well, apparently, Jim and Julie had a little feud going on with the Buckners. Steve had been asking for help from his sister and Jim would always help him out, but Jim said that Steve had really started to take advantage of it, including taking things without even asking, putting the kids up to asking, Jim and Julie for food, and, Jim was just starting to feel some kind of way about that, because he felt like Steve wasn't even trying to help his family. He was just taking advantage of the Schnicks. And this led to quite a bit of animosity between the Schnicks and the Buckners, and they thought that, Kirk could have been harboring some of that himself towards his aunt and uncle. So who knows? But on September 26th, the Buckners and Julie Schnick were laid to rest in a group funeral, with Jim being allowed to leave the hospital to attend. But because of his injuries, he said he couldn't walk to the graveside, so he just watched from a nearby car. Now, many family and friends would go over to the car and, offer to come by and help him later, or just try to offer some kind words or comfort, and they said he just didn't say anything. He just stared blankly. The entire town of Elkland showed up, and it's a neighboring town showed up to this funeral, more than 800 people total. And they said the 7 caskets lined up were terrible to see, but especially the small one for little toddler Michael. Now, as the days went on, police noticed that some things weren't quite adding up as they initially thought. It started with a phone call into the police department from one of Kirk's teachers. She says she heard on the news that pistol was found in Kirk's right hand, but he was left-handed. So that didn't make any sense to her. And this was pretty significant because none of Kirk's friends or family had ever mentioned this when police spoke to them. And another fact about the pistol in question was that it would have had to have been reloaded at least twice to carry out all these murders. And the police had recovered 0 shell casings in any of the crime scenes. Now, the next part, bear with me because I'm not a firearms expert or even a novice, but from what I read and understand, there's also something called a retaining pin that has to be used when reloading this type of weapon. It has to be removed, the weapon reloaded, and then placed back where it came from in order for it to fire. And when the pistol was recovered from Kirk's hand, there was no retaining pin. So police went back to each of the crime scenes to try to find the pin, but family and friends, in just an effort to be kind, had cleaned up the home, so there was no sign of this pin anywhere. Well, Kirk's autopsy also told a very interesting story. It was found that he had indeed been stabbed 3 times, but he was shot 3 times as well, and once of those was through the back, and it hit him in the heart, and that was the fatal blow that killed him. Now, ballistics proved that he was shot with the same caliber bullet as the pistol in his hand. So if he was shot, and it was fatal, how did he get the gun back in his hand unless somebody put it there? And police looked back at the crime scene photos and they realized there wasn't a whole lot of blood in that hallway. So if Kirk was stabbed and shot there, they would reason there should be a whole lot of blood. And Kirk was described as a smaller boy, like tall but really scrawny. And I read they originally guessed him to weigh about 90 pounds and later like 120, but regardless, he just did not have a huge presence. So would he have really been able to drag his father Steve's body, which was 250 pounds, from the truck to the cemetery like they had originally deduced? It really didn't make sense now, and the police were starting to feel like Kirk had been set up. So they decided to focus in on the sole survivor of this massacre, Jim Schnick, and they found out that Jim and Julie had been having some marital issues. Julie had recently discovered that Jim was having an affair with a lady named Nancy Bruner, and it had been going on for almost 2 years. Nancy was a 37-year-old mother of 2, and when she was brought in for questioning originally, she didn't have much to say, just that they were friends, and that was it, nothing more, yada yada. But a few days later, she had a change of heart. She showed back up at the police station, and she told them everything. The affair had begun in November of 1985 when he went to see Nancy about a chest injury while she was working out of her home as a paramedical examiner. They hit it off, and the appointment turned into a 4-hour thing, and they began a full-blown affair where they would meet up regularly to engage in sex. And Nancy claims in the beginning Jim had told her he was divorced, and since she lived a few towns over, she really might not have known he was married. But he also told her some other lies. He told her that he had proudly served his country in the military and fought in Vietnam, and that was a bunch of baloney. Now, Nancy would eventually find out that he was still married, but of course he convinced her that they were getting a divorce. Marriage was over, what they always say, right? And by August of 1987, he had convinced her that they were actually separated, and now Nancy and Jim could make their marriage plans. So they planned a trip to Silver Dollar City Amusement Park in Branson for their kids to meet. Now, Nancy and her kids get there first, and they're waiting on Jim and his kids to get there. And Jim shows up with his kids and with his wife, Julie. Now, it seems like Julie had no idea at this point, and somehow Jim kept the two women apart so that they couldn't talk to each other. And Nancy was able to get him to the side and question him about it. He just kind of blew it off. Oh, we'll talk about it later. Don't worry about it. And they never did. Well, that ticked Nancy off and grew her suspicion. So she just called the Schnick house. And when Julie answered, she's like, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you still married?" And of course, Julie said yes. So now Julie knew, and Julie started answering several of Nancy's questions, including outing him about the whole military service thing. Nancy is furious. And she claimed she ended their affair right there, which was about 5 weeks before the murders, and even told Jim and Julie that they needed to go to marriage counseling. Now, it is believed that Julie did say at this point she wanted the divorce, and Jim came completely clean about the affair, and that Julie also confided something in Jim at this point. I guess as they're telling everything, she let Jim know that she had been the victim of sexual assault from her brother Steve when she was around the age of 8. And one of her lifelong friends did confirm that this story was the same that she had been told by Julie as well. So, the animosity Jim had for Steve really grew at that point. And then he also said it was very hard for him to be intimate with Julie after this revelation. So there was a whole lot of pent-up emotion and anger just boiling into this feud. And then there were two other big pieces of the puzzle that they found. And that was two $50,000 life insurance policies on Julie and one on Jim that Nancy had signed off the physical exam for. Now, it was believed also that the Schnicks would inherit the Buckner farm should everybody pass away like this. So there's a whole lot of money and there's a whole lot of property on the line in the event of some deaths. Now, based on all this info, police put together a brand new timeline of what they now thought happened that morning of September 25th. They believe that Jim lured Steve Buckner over to his farm saying that he needed some help with some work he had to do. Somehow, Jim had gotten a hold of Jan's pistol and he fired on Steve when he arrived. He then dumped him at the cemetery, drove Steve's truck to the Buckner farm where he had found his sister-in-law Jan tending to their cows, and police believed he shot her as she was trying to run. Now, Kirk, who would have been up doing chores as well and probably would have tried to defend his mom, they believed he got involved, and that's when Jim shot him with that fatal shot. Next, Jim went inside and for whatever reason shot those three other sweet little boys as they were sleeping in their beds, loaded up Kirk's body into Steve's truck and drove it back to his own home, which is corroborated by Kirk's blood being found all in that truck. Jim carried him into the home, put his body in the hallway, and stabbed his already dead body to back up the story about the struggle. Then Jim went upstairs, shot Julie while she slept, went downstairs and shot himself twice to try to make it look good. This kind of backfired because I guess he was scared to shoot himself really good, so he just gave himself the superficial wounds, and that actually turned out to be a huge red flag to police. But anyway, he did that, and then he goes and wakes up and involves his 8-year-old to help him with that police phone call. And all this was just wrapped up with a bow when they found the pin to that pistol that I was talking about earlier in the pocket of Jim's pants he was wearing that day that had been taken into evidence. So on October 1st, 1987, Jim was brought into questioning again, and they confronted him with the lies by asking him some real probing questions, and then said, "Why don't you take a polygraph?" And he said, "Okay, I will, but I don't feel good today, so how about next Monday?" They agree, and they go pick him up on October 6th from Julie's parents' house where he's staying with the kids. And they took him to Springfield where the polygraph was to be administered. Now, while the technician is, getting him all hooked up with everything, he's like, whoa, stop. Let's not do this. I'm ready to talk. And police click that record button, and they start recording Jim's newest version of his events from that day. Now, he did say Julie had found out about the affair, and she is very upset. And they had argued early that morning, and she actually called her brother on the phone to vent. Steve got upset. He grabbed that family pistol, and he headed to the Schnick farm about 4 a.m. Jim said that, Steve pulls up, and they start to argue. Steve pulls the pistol out of the truck, and he aims it at Jim and threatens to remove him from the family. Jim said at that moment he snapped. They start fighting, and there's a struggle, and the pistol just accidentally went off twice and hit Steve in the back of the head. He panicked, he put him in the truck, dumped him at the cemetery, and headed over to the Buckner farm to kill Jan since she likely knew where Steve had been that morning. Now, he found her by the milk barn, and he shot her twice as she tried to run from him. These shots startled Kirk, who had been sleeping in the back of that camper truck. He jumped out, and he and Jim began to struggle, and again, the gun goes off accidentally and hits Kirk in the back with that fatal shot. Then, for whatever reason, Jim went inside to, quote, destroy the other 3 children. He said he'd always thought that they'd be better off living with God than as they were living there on that farm. Jim said that he noticed when he came back outside to leave, Kirk was actually still alive. So in an effort to help save him, he loaded him in the truck and took him back to his house. Not to the hospital, but okay. He carried him inside over his shoulder and took him upstairs to wake up Julie to tell her to get up. And somehow, with Kirk on his shoulder and the gun still, and he's juggling and struggling, it went off again, accidentally, and shot Julie twice in the forehead. At that point, he went into cover-up mode and wanted to make it look like Kirk was the killer. He moved him into the hallway downstairs, where he shot him 2 more times and stabbed him, and then he shot himself before waking up his son to help call for police. Now, he described all of this just stoically. No tears, no nothing. Of course, the police didn't believe any of this. It didn't hold water. No one believed that a gun could just go off that many times accidentally and shoot people from behind. But Julie's autopsy also confirmed that she was shot at very close range. So, no. Now, police did immediately clear Kirk's name publicly, and Jim was charged with first-degree murder of all 7 victims, but he only stood trial for Julie, Kirk, and Michael, and I couldn't find a reason why the other 4 were dismissed, but the court documents did say that they were dismissed without prejudice for retrial. But regardless, when the trial began on April 11th of 1988, that courtroom was packed. People were waiting to get in to see, some to see him brought to justice, some to hear the story. And his lawyers, they were going for a temporary insanity defense. There were a ton of character witnesses on his behalf because there was a lot of people that loved him and just thought he cracked. Now, Nancy also took that stand. She confirmed the affair, but she said it was not planned out of any knowledge of hers. But after closing arguments and deliberations, Jim was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder, meaning that jury did find reason to believe that these murders were planned out and premeditated. He was sentenced to death, but that conviction was actually overturned in the early 90s due to an issue with a juror. So the trial would have needed to have been reheld, but Jim decided at that point he would rather plead guilty in a deal with the prosecutors to take the death penalty off the table and just exchange that for life without parole. So Jim Schnick is currently serving his sentence in a Missouri State Correctional Facility. So, what do I think? Well, first, I feel heartbroken for Kirk. That at any point he stood accused of something he didn't do. He was a 14-year-old little boy whose life was taken from him. And then these lies spread around on him. I mean, if that's like the definition of insult to injury, right? But for this just whole family to lose their lives, like over what? I mean, an affair, like I got it. That's not the best look. But to take out 7 people in the fallout, I mean, I just don't get it. And I mean, maybe they were right, like people saying, that he snapped, but with all that was going on in his head, Julie's assault, the affair, the arguing, but that to me just doesn't explain those sweet little sleeping babies and what he did to those poor little boys. And I mean, I'm thankful that there was, I guess, some sort of rationale in his head and he stopped and spared his own children. And I know people are probably like, well, that was his own kids. But still, they were innocent, and thank God there was 2 lives spared that day. I don't know, y'all. But anyway, that's it for me today, guys. As always, if you like this, please consider subscribing and turning on that notification bell and helping the channel out. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay sweet, my cupcakes. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye!